Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 22 April 2024. Today is the tricentennial of the birth of Immanuel Kant, who was born 300 years ago today in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, on this date in 1724. Kant is recognized as being among the handful of great philosophers in the Western tradition. If anyone is ever going to name off a list, it's going to include Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, and a few others. But he's up there in the philosophical pantheon. And although Kant is notorious for the difficulty of his style, both because of the conceptual difficulty of the work and his not particularly felicitous writing style, he can also be very clear and to the point when he wants to be. So near the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant wrote, quote, "The whole interest of my reason, whether speculative or practical, is concentrated in the three following questions. 1, what can I know? 2, what should I do? 3, what may I hope?" Unquote. These three questions explain Kant's interest in the epistemology of the Critique of Pure Reason, the ethics of the Critique of Practical Reason, and the philosophy of history that flows throughout all of Kant's thought. Kant wrote about philosophy of history throughout his life, including during his pre-critical period, that is to say, before his three critiques. Most historians of philosophy break Kant's thought up into his pre-critical period before he wrote the three critiques: the critique of reason, critique of pure reason, critique of judgment, critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment, and before and after those critiques. So Kant's philosophy of history spans his entire career, but he never wrote a critique of historical reason or any other major work specifically on the philosophy of history. So if we want a Kantian philosophy of history, we have to reconstruct it from his shorter writings. But Kant left us quite enough material that this reconstruction is possible. And Kant was an extremely systematic thinker, so he often summarizes his arguments in explicitly numbered propositions, and that makes it all the easier for us to extract Kant's salient points. Kant's early book, Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, from 1755, gives us the cosmological context of Kant's understanding of the place of human beings in the universe. Much of Kant's conception in this book is essentially modern. In fact, Kant turned out to be correct on several cosmological speculations that he made, later vindicated by scientific cosmology. And a lot of the attitude in it sounds very familiar to us today. For example, here at the beginning of chapter 7, "The universe, by its immeasurable greatness and the infinite variety and beauty that shine from it on all sides, fills us with silent wonder. If the presentation of all this perfection moves the imagination, the understanding is seized by another kind of rapture, when, from another point of view, it considers how such magnificence and such greatness can flow from a single law with an eternal and perfect order." Unquote. There's a lot of internal references in that sentence to other concerns of Kant, like the reference to being moved by the perfection is an implicit reference to Kant's distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. The beautiful charms us, and the sublime moves us. And there, the reference to laws is a reference to Newtonian science, which was for Kant the paradigm of scientific work. So that was Kant in 1755 during his pre-critical period. But this is mirrored by a famous passage from the end of Kant's Critique of Practical Reason, which is from 1787, so quite a few years later. So this is a passage that's quoted quite frequently in relation to Kant. Quote, Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the oftener and the more steady we reflect on them, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. I have not to search for them and conjecture them as though they were veiled in darkness or were in the transcendent reason beyond my horizon. I see them before me and connect them directly with the consciousness of my existence. The former begins from the place I occupy in the external world of sense and enlarges my connection therein to the unbounded extent with worlds upon worlds and systems of systems, and moreover into limitless times of their periodic motion, its beginning and continuance. The second begins from my invisible self, my personality, and exhibits me in a world which has true infinity, but which is traceable only by the understanding, and with which I discern I am not in a merely contingent, but in a universal and necessary connection, as I am thereby with all those visible worlds, unquote. So here we see Kant, very much the cosmological and the ethical are fused and almost indistinguishable, as it were, which is understandable for a philosopher for whom ethics was as central as it was for Kant. Also, this passage sounds like exactly something you'd find out of Carl Sagan, wondering about the awe-inspiring vastness of the universe, but also connecting it to the human who is observing all this. But it isn't all like this in Kant. While the book on universal natural history is written in a primarily naturalistic idiom, it is interspersed throughout with ethical observations and assurances that divine providence is at work in nature. So I will make another quote from this near the end of the book, lumping together, leaving out a bunch, but lumping in to get enough to give you a sense of what Kant is getting at the end of this book. Quote, "We ought not to lament the perishing of a world as a real loss of nature. What an innumerable multitude of flowers and insects are destroyed by a single cold day, and how little they are missed. The injurious influences of infected air, earthquakes, and inundations sweep whole peoples from the earth, but it does not appear that nature has thereby suffered any damage. The greatness of what was to perish is not the least obstacle to it, for all that is great becomes small. Nay, it becomes as if it were a mere point when it is compared with the infinitude which creation has to exhibit in unlimited space throughout the succession of eternity." Unquote. That's pretty characteristic of this book. And I think it gives us the larger natural history context in which Kant develops the rest of his thought, which is essentially constructed within this natural historical context. Kant gives us the beginnings of human history in a 1786 paper, which has been translated as Conjectural Beginning of Human History or Speculative Beginning of Human History. Kant formulates what we would today call a rational reconstruction of prehistory, although it's prehistory understood in the sense in which the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century saw it. And the Enlightenment thinkers felt keenly the gap between the biblical creation story and the beginning of recorded history. And they attempted to fill this gap in a way not unlike what Kant did in interpolating a speculative account of what happened between the creation, between civilization as they knew it in their time. So this is essentially a grand exercise of what Collingwood called the a priori historical imagination, which fills in the gaps in the historical record between known events. But Kant pushes this idea quite a good distance beyond what Collingwood envisioned. So in this essay, Conjectural Beginning of Human History, he specifies 4 developments in the human mind as follows. Quote, "But soon reason began to stir, a sense different from that to which instinct was tied, the sense, say, of of sights presented other than food that normally normally consumed is similar to it. And reason, instituting a comparison, sought to enlarge its knowledge of foodstuff beyond the bounds of instinctual knowledge, unquote. So he's saying the first development here is the development of agriculture. And that's pretty much in line with a lot of contemporary thought. This is with a major, not only a technical development, but also a cognitive development, that human beings were able to plan far enough ahead into the future to develop agriculture as a supply for food. Then he writes, quote, next to the instinct for food, the means of which nature preserves the individual, the greatest prominence belongs to the sexual instinct, by means of which she preserves the species. Reason, once aroused, did not delay in demonstrating in its influence here as well. Refusal was the feat which brought about the passage from merely sensual to spiritual attractions, from mere animal desire gradually to love, and along with this from the feeling of the merely agreeable to a taste for beauty, at first only for beauty in man, but at length beauty in nature as well. In addition, there came a first hint of the development of man as a moral creature, unquote. So here Kant is saying the next step in the development of the mind was the control of sexual impulses, implying the construction of a orderly and stable society, and what he calls the first hint of development of man as a moral creature. Then we have, quote, reason took its third step. This was the conscious expectation of the future. This capacity for facing up in the present to the often very distant future, instead of being wholly absorbed by the enjoyment of the present, is the most decisive mark of the human's advantage, unquote. So, third step in the development of the human mind is the ability to engage in long-range planning for the future. And then his fourth provision, quote, but there is yet a fourth and final step which reason took, and this raised man altogether above community with animals. He came to understand, how obscurely, that he is the true end of nature, and that nothing lives on earth and can compete with him in this regard, unquote. Today we would call that, excuse me, anthropocentrism. For Kant, it was just common sense, and this was how the world was organized. Although further along, I'll get to an argument that this view of man as the ultimate end of the universe has its limitations, as set in a larger context. So that was his essay on the conjectural beginnings of the human history. So I started out by reading from the Universal Natural History, which gives us a natural historical context. Then Kant gives us this speculation on the origins and development of the human mind. And then in another work, the idea for a universal history from a cosmopolitan perspective from 1786 lays out Kant's framework for natural history, much as Kant's work on universal natural history lays out Kant's framework for natural history. So in this work, there are 9 propositions that Kant formulated that gives his overall framework for human history. First thesis, all natural capacities of a creature are destined to evolve completely to their natural end. So that's Kant's teleology. And the third critique of judgment, was all about teleology. So teleology is a prominent factor in Kant's conception of history. Second thesis, in man, as the only rational creature on earth, those natural capacities which are directed to the use of his reason are to be fully developed only in the race, not in the individual. So Kant is saying there that the capacities that nature is developing through human beings are being developed in the species. So it's the whole of the human race that's going to develop these capacities, and not some individual. Third thesis, nature has willed that man should by himself produce everything that goes beyond the mechanical ordering of his animal existence, and that he should partake of no other happiness or perfection than that which he himself, independently of instinct, has created for his own reason. Kant is saying that we are going to build a human world, and this human world we construct, that is going to be our happiness and our perfection. Fourth thesis. The means employed by nature to bring about the development of all the capacities of men is their antagonism in society, and so far as this is, in the end, the cause of a lawful ordering among men. And then he goes on to say, by antagonism, I mean the unsocial sociability of men. We can compare this to the almost contemporaneous, Mandeville's fable of the bees and the grumbling hive, where the hive that everyone is dissatisfied is actually the one that's growing and prosperous, and the virtuous hive is the one that's essentially barren. So this is almost a Hegelian conception of history driven forward through conflict, through what Kant calls unsocial sociability of man. Fifth thesis. The greatest problem for the human race, to the solution of which nature drives man, is the achievement of a universal civic society which administers law among men. So this is Kant's political philosophy. And that will figure more again in the next couple of theses. So the human world that we're creating, that is going to be our happiness and our perfection as a species, is a universal civic society which administers law among all men. Sixth thesis. The problem is the most difficult and the last to be solved by mankind. So if we think of things like hunger or material want and need, those are problems to be solved by the human world we're constructing, but the last and most difficult problem is the creation of a stable civil and social order. Seventh thesis. The problem of establishing a perfect civic constitution is dependent upon the problem of a lawful external relation among states and cannot be solved without a solution of the latter problem. So yes, that's a big problem, and it's a big question, but Kant devoted another work to that problem. So I'm going to pause with that essay at the seventh thesis to take up Kant's 1795 essay, Perpetual Peace, because we can shoehorn Kant's Perpetual Peace essay into this seventh thesis, which is about the creation of a law-governed external relation among states. So the previous theses were in this work were about the creation of a perfect civil constitution, but the perfect civil constitution has to take place within the larger context of a peaceful order among states. So I set aside the universal history with cosmopolitan intent to read the theses of Perpetual Peace. So in the first section of Perpetual Peace, Kant lays out six points. One, no treaty of peace that tacitly reserves issues for a future war shall be held valid. Well, that's not very likely to ever happen in a war, but that's the ideal that Kant held out for peace. Every treaty that ends a war should solve everything. He doesn't say what we're going to do if we're supposed to just keep fighting if we can't come up with that perfect treaty. Two, no independent nation, be it large or small, may be acquired by another nation by inheritance, exchange, purchase, or gift. Well, that's less of an issue today because during the Enlightenment and before, it was not unusual for a royal family to pass territorial possessions from one royal house to another, say through inheritance, through a marriage, etc., things like that. And still, there are the possibilities of one country buying out another. So that's not entirely irrelevant now, but this is one of the things that was Kant thought so important that it needed to be among his 6 provisions here for perpetual peace. 3, standing armies shall be gradually abolished. So here we're starting to verge on the utopian, because he wants an order among nation states that will not involve armies. 4, no national debt shall be contracted in connection with the foreign affairs of the nation. Well, today we're even farther from that ideal than in Kant's days, because all nation states, including the wealthiest nation states in the world, have contracted enormous public debts. And to a certain extent, this does deleteriously drive public policy and even sometimes wars. So the failure to do that could be used as a Kantian explanation for continued conflict and the failure to achieve perpetual peace as Kant conceived it. 5, no nation shall forcibly interfere with the constitution and government of another. Oh, that's another that has come and gone over time. It's almost like we have swings in history between periods in which interference in the affairs of other nations is expected and a norm, and at other times when it is viewed as completely unacceptable and a violation of the international order. Number 6, no nation at war with another shall permit such acts of war as shall make mutual trust impossible during some future time of peace. Such acts include the use of assassins, poisoners, breach of surrender, instigation of treason in the opposing nation, etc. So those 6 provisions are Kant's recipe for perpetual peace. We are at least as far away from them in our time in the 21st century as Kant was from them in the 18th century. But we can certainly see that if these things could be, if we could converge more closely toward the ideals that Kant lays out, no standing armies, no national debts, no committing of atrocities during wartime, because that would make it trust impossible after the war is over. If we could get to that point, maybe we would be closer to approximating the ideal of perpetual peace. So, like I said, I suspended my reading of the other one to outline the provisions for perpetual peace, because as we saw in the 7th thesis of the idea for a universal history, that the problem of establishing a perfect civic constitution is dependent upon the problem of lawful external relations among states and cannot be solved without a solution of the latter problem. So there we saw in Kant's perpetual peace essay from 1795 that he states explicitly what he thinks is going to be involved in this problem of establishing a lawful external relation among states, which is the condition of having a perfect civil constitution. 8th thesis. Now we're back to idea for a universal history of cosmopolitan intent. The history of mankind can be seen in the large as the realization of nature's secret plan to bring forth a perfectly constituted state as the only condition in which the capacities of mankind can be fully developed, and also bring forth that external relation among states that is perfectly adequate to this end. So this is not merely the human perfection and happiness. This is something that nature is trying to bring about through humanity. The 9th and last thesis. A philosophical attempt to work out a universal history according to the natural plan directed by achieving the civic union to the human race must be regarded as possible, and indeed as contributing to the end of nature. So here I think Kant is saying that we need to write a book or several books or a library full of books in order to lay out what this perfect civil constitution would be, what this perfect international order would be, and how we can get there. And Kant himself worked on that after this earlier essay when he returned to the problem in Perpetual Peace in 1795. So that takes us through Kant's overall framework for human history. But he also wrote an essay in 1794, the year before Perpetual Peace, called The End of All Things. And there he considers what we would today call eschatology and the various conceptions of the end of the world. Quote, "But why do people expect an end to the world at all? And even if this is granted them, why precisely a terrifying end, which is the case of the majority of the human race? The basis for the first belief seems to be that reason tells them the duration of the world has a value only to the extent that rational creatures in it are commensurate with the ultimate purpose of its existence. But if this was not meant to be achieved, creation itself appears pointless to them, like a drama that is totally without issue and has no rational design. The second belief is based on the notion of the depraved nature of the human race, which is vast to the point of despair. A race for which the preparation of an end, and indeed a frightful end, is the only measure proper to the highest wisdom and justice in the opinion of the greatest number of people. Hence the omens of doomsday are all that of a dreadful kind, for when is an imagination excited by great expectation wanting in omens and miracles," unquote. So there Kant is giving us a little taste of the popular eschatology of his day and warnings of doomsday and the place of mankind within that, which involved, an expectation of the punishment of the sins of humanity in a terrible doomsday. Kant revisited the end of the world in a work from 1798, so even later than Perpetual Peace, titled The Strife of the Faculties, which includes an interesting section titled "An Old Question Raised Again, Is the Human Race Constantly Progressing?" In this, Kant distinguishes among three conceptions of history, what he calls the terroristic manner of representing human history, which is essentially declensionist. That is to say, it's concerned with decline, but it's specifically concerned with moral decline. So Kant's terroristic manner of representing history is an abyss of moral declension. Then the second one is a eudemonistic manner of representing history. So this is progressive, but it's morally progressive. As with the terroristic manner of representing history, it's a morally progressive vision of history. And then he gives his third option, which is what he calls the abderitic hypothesis, which is mixed and therefore, according to Kant, stagnant. So there's some moral declension, there is some moral progress, but these end up canceling each other out, and society ends up stagnating, and the whole human project, in a sense, ends up stagnating. Clearly, on the whole, Kant believed in progress, and his Enlightenment account of history seamlessly integrates divine providence and worldly human progress. But there's also a naturalism in Kant that's not found in earlier philosophical thought, and indeed it's rarely found even after Kant. In his pre-critical universal natural history, Kant repeatedly asserts that nature is prodigal both in its creation of entire worlds and in their destruction. In Kant's unwritten philosophy of history, the entire history of humanity must be placed in this larger context, so that we as human beings are an expression of nature's prodigality. And when we are eventually swept away from the universe, nature will not grieve for us, and it is right not to grieve for us. We are a part of the greatness of what has to perish in order that even greater things come into being. Which leads me to the point that no one calls Kant a cyclical philosopher of history, but his cosmological perspective on history is that even entire worlds come and go. His Enlightenment belief in progress implies a strictly linear view of history, but his larger conception of cosmological history, within which human history is located, recognizes that progress, like greatness, comes and goes too. If further progress with the resources of one world is swept away by a cosmic catastrophe, the larger cosmological project of progress will be picked up again, presumably on some other world. So we could call this a spiral conception of history in which worlds and even entire species make their contribution to cosmological progress and then pass from the scene of history, passing the baton along to some other world and its species. So this is, in a sense, a philosophy of progress, but it is a philosophy of cosmological progress in which human beings have a role to play, but we are ultimately dispensable. And I don't think many people who talk about Kant's philosophy of history have fully come to terms with that, or fully come to terms with the fact that our only consolation in this picture is our rational hope in this process of cosmological progress. So happy 300th birthday to Immanuel Kant, and thanks for listening.